Have you ever wondered how Cain, one of the very first sons of Adam and Eve, could have found a wife and started a family if his parents were supposedly the only humans on earth? This question has puzzled believers for thousands of years. Think about it. If Adam and Eve truly were humanity's first and only parents, then where exactly did Cain find his wife? How could there have been other people in the world for him to marry? But here's what makes this mystery even more intriguing. When God punished Cain for murdering his brother Abel, Cain cried out in fear, saying, "Everyone who finds me will kill me." Everyone? Who exactly was he talking about? If only 4 people existed on the planet, Adam, Eve, Cain, and the now dead Abel, then who were these mysterious others Cain feared so greatly? And here's something that might blow your mind. The Bible actually gives us clues to solve this mystery, but most people completely miss them. There are forgotten daughters mentioned briefly in Scripture. Ancient texts even name some of these specific women. And surprisingly, scientific evidence aligns perfectly with these biblical accounts. Could it be that we've misunderstood this story for centuries? What if solving the mystery of Cain's wife reveals something profound about God's plan, about human nature, or even about how families really worked in the ancient world? I'm about to show you evidence most pastors never discuss. You'll see scientific research that confirms the biblical narrative, and you'll discover historical documents that finally fill in the gaps of this ancient puzzle. But I'll warn you, some of what you're about to discover might challenge everything you thought you knew about humanity's very first family. So if you're ready to dive deep into one of the Bible's greatest mysteries, drop a mystery in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that like button, because this journey will take you to places you never expected. Together, let's uncover the truth about Cain's wife and the forgotten daughters of Eden. Trust me, by the end of this video, you'll never read the book of Genesis the same way again. In the beginning, before kingdoms rose and languages divided, before laws were written and consequences were understood, there lived 2 brothers whose story would echo through every generation of humanity. Their names were Cain and Abel, and their tale is far more complex than most people realize. Picture this. The world is still young, still close to perfection. Adam and Eve have been expelled from Eden, but the memory of paradise still lingers in the air they breathe. Their firstborn, Cain, works the soil with his hands, coaxing life from the ground that was once perfect but now resists his efforts. His younger brother Abel tends flocks under the open sky, watching over creatures that still remember what it was like before death entered the world. Both brothers know about God. Both brothers understand the importance of worship. Both brothers bring offerings to the Almighty. But here's where most people get the story completely wrong. For generations, people have assumed that God was somehow unfair to Cain, that he arbitrarily chose Abel's animal sacrifice over Cain's vegetables. But that's not what happened at all. The issue wasn't what they brought, it was how they brought it and why they brought it. Look carefully at the biblical account. Abel brought the firstborn of his flock, including their fat portions. This wasn't just any sheep. This was the best sheep, the most valuable, the cream of the crop. The Hebrew text emphasizes that Abel gave with excellence, with reverence, with his whole heart. Cain, on the other hand, brought some of the fruits of the soil. Notice the difference? Not the best fruits, not the first fruits, just some fruits. It was like showing up to honor the President of the United States with a wilted bouquet you grabbed from your backyard, while your brother presents a carefully crafted tribute. This reveals something profound about human nature that we see played out in American society every day. Think about it. How many times have you seen someone put in minimal effort at work and then get bitter when someone else gets the promotion? How often do we see students who barely study complain that their grades aren't as high as their classmates who spend hours in the library? Modern psychology has extensively studied this phenomenon. Dr. Robert Sapolsky's research at Stanford University shows that perceived unfairness, especially when we know deep down that we haven't given our best, triggers the same brain chemistry that leads to violence and aggression. This is exactly what happened to Cain. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. God didn't just reject Cain's offering and walk away. In Genesis 4:6-7, we see one of the most beautiful examples of divine intervention in human history. God comes to Cain personally and says, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." Can you imagine that? The creator of the universe, taking time to counsel a bitter, angry young man. God wasn't condemning Cain. He was offering him a roadmap to redemption. This wasn't divine rejection. This was divine intervention. But Cain had a choice to make. He could humble himself, acknowledge his half-hearted offering, and try again. Or he could let the poison of jealousy consume him completely. We all know which path he chose. The next verse is one of the most chilling in all of Scripture. Now Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out to the field." While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was premeditated murder. Cain invited Abel away from their parents, away from any witnesses, to a place where no one could hear Abel's cries for help. And there, with the same hands that had worked the soil, Cain spilled his brother's blood upon the ground. This moment changed everything. Not just for Cain, not just for Abel, but for all of humanity. This was the first time a human being deliberately took another human life. The first time brother turned against brother. The first time the earth drank human blood. But what happened next reveals a mystery that most people completely overlook. And it's this mystery that holds the key to understanding how Cain found his wife. When God confronted Cain about Abel's disappearance, Cain's response was just as telling as his crime. "Am I my brother's keeper?" Even in the face of divine questioning, Cain showed no remorse, no guilt, no acknowledgement of what he had done. God's judgment was swift and precise. "Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." But then Cain said something that should make us all stop and think. He cried out, "My punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." Wait. Stop right there. Whoever finds me will kill me. If Adam and Eve were the only parents, and Abel was now dead, then who exactly was Cain afraid of? Who were these mysterious others who might seek vengeance on him? This is where the mystery deepens, and where most Bible teachers fall silent, because the answer to this question opens up a whole new understanding of what really happened in those early days of humanity. Here we encounter one of the most puzzling aspects of the Cain and Abel story, a detail so obvious that we often overlook it, yet so profound that it changes everything we think we know about early human history. Let's examine Cain's words more carefully. "I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." These aren't the words of someone who believes he's one of only 3 people left on the planet. These are the words of someone who knows there are others out there. others who might recognize him, others who might seek justice for Abel's murder. And here's what's even more remarkable. God takes Cain's fears seriously. Instead of saying, "Don't be ridiculous, there's nobody else out there," God responds by placing a protective mark on Cain and declaring, "Not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over." Think about this logically. Why would God need to protect Cain from people who didn't exist? Why would he need to place a supernatural warning sign on a man if there was no one around to see it? This leads us to one of the most important questions in biblical studies. How much time had actually passed between the creation of Adam and Eve and the murder of Abel? Here's where most people make a crucial mistake. We tend to think of biblical narratives as happening in quick succession. Adam and Eve are created. They have Cain and Abel. Abel gets murdered. End of story. But the Bible doesn't actually give us those kinds of tight timelines. Consider this. Adam lived 930 years. Eve presumably lived a similar lifespan. If they were created as mature adults, let's say the equivalent of 20 to 25 years old, and if they started having children relatively quickly after leaving Eden, how many offspring could they have had by the time Cain killed Abel? Modern demographic studies of high fertility populations show us some fascinating possibilities. The Hutterites, an American religious community known for their large families, averaged 10-12 children per family. But we're not talking about modern lifespans here. We're talking about people who lived for nearly a millennium. Dr. Henry Morris, former professor of hydraulic engineering at Virginia Tech, calculated that if Adam and Eve had children at the same rate as modern high-fertility populations throughout their long lifespans, they could have had over 100 children. That's just Adam and Eve themselves, not counting their children's children. Now, here's where the math gets really interesting. Population geneticists have developed models for how quickly small populations can grow under ideal conditions. Dr. John Sanford, former Cornell University professor and inventor of the gene gun, has shown that even with conservative estimates, a founding population of 2 people could easily reach several hundred individuals within just a few centuries. Let's be extremely conservative and say that by the time of Abel's murder, Adam and Eve had only 20 children, and those children had started having families of their own. Even with that modest estimate, we could be looking at a population of 50, 100 people by the time Cain committed his crime. This explains so much about the biblical narrative that confused scholars for generations. It explains why Cain was afraid of being found and killed. It explains why God felt the need to protect him with a supernatural mark. It explains how Cain could later find a wife and build a city. But here's what's truly fascinating. This interpretation aligns perfectly with archaeological evidence of early human settlement patterns. Archaeological sites around the world show evidence of rapid population expansion and sophisticated social organization appearing relatively suddenly in the historical record. The Göbekli Tepe site in Turkey, for example, shows evidence of complex community organization and massive construction projects that would have required significant populations and social coordination. Carbon dating puts these developments at roughly the time frame that many biblical chronologists associate with the early post-Eden period. In America, we see similar patterns in our own history. The Mayflower Compact was signed by just 41 men in 1620. Yet within a single generation, the Massachusetts Bay Colony had thousands of residents. Small founding populations, given the right conditions, can explode into thriving communities remarkably quickly. The Lewis and Clark expedition encountered Native American tribes throughout the American West that had grown from small founding groups into complex societies with sophisticated social structures, trade networks, and territorial boundaries. This demonstrates how quickly human populations can expand and organize themselves across large geographical areas. But this raises another crucial question. If there were indeed more people alive during Cain's time than just the immediate family of Adam and Eve, who were they? Where did they come from? The answer to this question has been hiding in plain sight in the pages of Scripture for thousands of years. But it involves a group of people that the Bible mentions but rarely names. A group whose stories have been largely forgotten by history. I'm talking about the daughters of Adam and Eve, the women whose names we don't know, whose stories weren't told, but whose existence was essential to the continuation of the human race. And understanding their role in early human history doesn't just solve the mystery of Cain's wife. It reveals something profound about how God's plan for humanity unfolded in ways that most people never consider. One of the most striking aspects of early biblical history is what's not mentioned as much as what is. We know the names Cain, Abel, and Seth. We know their stories, their occupations, their legacies. But there's an entire population of people who lived alongside them, who were equally important to the continuation of the human race, yet whose names and stories have been largely erased from the historical record. I'm talking about the daughters of Adam and Eve. Genesis 5:4 gives us a tantalizing glimpse into this hidden history. After Seth was born, Adam lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Other sons and daughters. Not just a few, but enough that the text uses the plural form, suggesting multiple children of both genders born over the course of Adam's extraordinarily long life. But here's what's remarkable. Despite being essential to the survival and growth of the human race, these daughters are never named in the canonical biblical text. Their stories are never told. Their contributions are never acknowledged. They exist in the narrative only as an afterthought, a footnote to the important stories of their brothers. This pattern of omitting women's stories wasn't unique to biblical literature. It was a characteristic of ancient Near Eastern writing in general. In a patriarchal society where lineage was traced through the male line, where property was inherited by sons, and where social status was determined by paternal ancestry, women's stories were often considered less important to preserve. But this doesn't mean these women weren't important. In fact, from a purely practical standpoint, they were absolutely essential. Without them, there would be no human race at all. Dr. Carol Myers, professor of biblical studies at Duke University, has spent decades studying the role of women in ancient Israel. Her research shows that in small, survival-focused communities, women weren't just wives and mothers. They were co-leaders, decision-makers, and essential contributors to every aspect of community life. Think about it. In a world where survival depended on everyone contributing their skills and knowledge, where the total human population could have been measured in the dozens or hundreds rather than millions, every single person would have been vital to the community's success. These forgotten daughters would have been essential partners in the work of civilization building. They would have developed crucial skills in food preparation, textile production, child rearing, herbal medicine, and countless other areas of knowledge that were necessary for human survival and flourishing. But beyond their practical contributions, these women would have played a crucial role in another aspect of early human life. They would have been the potential wives for their brothers and male relatives. Now, before you recoil at that idea, remember that we're talking about a completely different world with completely different circumstances. In modern America, with a global population of over 8 billion people, the idea of marrying within the family seems not only unnecessary, but taboo. But in a world where the total human population might have been less than the number of people in a modern high school, the math was entirely different. Modern population genetics has shown us that small founding populations can be perfectly viable. provided they start with good genetic material. The Amish community in America provides a fascinating modern example. Despite descending from only about 200 founding individuals in the 1700s, and despite a high degree of intermarriage within the community, the Amish population has grown to over 300,000 people and remains genetically healthy. The difference, of course, is that Adam and Eve would have started with perfect genetic material. No mutations, no genetic diseases, no accumulated damage from generations of environmental exposure and genetic drift. Their children would have inherited this genetic superiority, making intermarriage not only possible, but relatively safe for several generations. Dr. John Sanford's research on genetic entropy suggests that the human genome has been gradually degrading over time due to accumulated mutations. This means that early humans would have had far superior genetic material compared to modern humans, making them much more resistant to the genetic problems that can arise from limited population sizes. But let's get back to those forgotten daughters. Who were they? What were their names? What were their stories? The canonical Bible doesn't tell us, but it's not the only ancient text that deals with early human history. There are other sources, texts that aren't included in the standard biblical canon, but that provide additional details about these early generations. One of the most detailed of these sources is the Book of Jubilees, sometimes called Little Genesis. This ancient text, which dates back to at least the 2nd century BCE, provides extensive genealogies and narratives that fill in many of the gaps left by the canonical Genesis account. According to Jubilees, Adam and Eve had numerous children, including daughters with specific names and roles. The text names 2 daughters in particular, Awan and Azura. These women, according to this ancient source, played crucial roles in the continuation of the human race. Awan, according to Jubilees, became the wife of Cain. The text suggests she was born after the expulsion from Eden and was likely significantly younger than Cain himself. Her name, which some scholars believe derives from ancient Hebrew roots meaning power or strength, suggests she may have been seen as a particularly significant figure in early human history. Azura, according to the same source, became the wife of Seth, the son born to Adam and Eve after Abel's death. Her name is associated with the color blue or sky, possibly suggesting purity or divine connection. Now, it's important to note that the Book of Jubilees is not considered canonical by most Christian denominations or by mainstream Judaism. Its historical reliability is debated among scholars, and different religious traditions have varying opinions about its value as a source of information about early human history. However, the fact that such detailed traditions about these women existed in ancient times suggests that their stories were considered important enough to preserve, even if they weren't included in the final biblical canon. It also suggests that the writers of these texts recognized the logical necessity of explaining how early human populations grew and intermarried. Whether we accept the specific details provided by texts like Jubilees or not, the fundamental question remains. The daughters of Adam and Eve existed. They played essential roles in early human history. And understanding their stories helps us solve the mystery of how Cain found his wife. But to fully understand how this worked, we need to look at evidence from another source entirely. One that provides fascinating insights into how early human populations actually functioned and survived. While the canonical Bible gives us the broad strokes of early human history, there's an ancient text that fills in remarkable detail about the people and events that shaped humanity's earliest generations. This book has been preserved for over 2,000 years, was considered sacred by some of the world's earliest Christian communities, and contains information about biblical figures that you won't find anywhere else in religious literature. It's called the Book of Jubilees, and most Christians have never heard of it. The Book of Jubilees, sometimes referred to as Little Genesis or the Apocalypse of Moses, is what scholars call an apocryphal text, meaning it's not included in the standard biblical canon recognized by most Christian denominations today. But its historical significance and the detailed information it provides about early biblical history make it one of the most fascinating documents from the ancient world. Written sometime between 160–150 BCE, Jubilees claims to contain revelations given to Moses during his 40 days on Mount Sinai. Whether you accept that claim or not, the book represents an ancient Jewish interpretation of Genesis that provides extraordinary detail about events and people that the canonical Bible only mentions in passing. Here's what makes Jubilees particularly relevant to our mystery. It names the daughters of Adam and Eve and provides specific information about who married whom in those early generations. According to Jubilees, Adam and Eve had 5 children: Cain, Abel, Seth, Iwan, and Azura. The text provides detailed chronologies, explains family relationships, and even gives specific ages for when various marriages took place. Awan, according to this ancient source, was born in the 3rd week of the 2nd Jubilee. Jubilees operates on a 49-year cycle system, which would place her birth several decades after Cain and Abel. The text explicitly states that Cain took Awan as his wife, solving the mystery that has puzzled biblical scholars for millennia. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Jubilees doesn't just name these women, it gives them agency and importance in the narrative. Azura, described as exceptionally beautiful and wise, becomes the wife of Seth and is portrayed as a significant figure in maintaining the spiritual heritage of the human race. The question is, should we trust this information? Different religious traditions have vastly different opinions about the Book of Jubilees. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church considers it canonical scripture, as authoritative as Genesis or Exodus. Some Jewish communities have traditionally held it in high regard, and fragments of Jubilees were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, indicating that it was valued by some Jewish communities around the time of Christ. However, most Protestant and Catholic churches do not consider Jubilees to be inspired scripture. They view it as a valuable historical document that provides insight into ancient Jewish thought and interpretation, but not as divinely authoritative. Dr. James Vanderkam, Professor Emeritus at the University of Notre Dame and one of the world's leading experts on Jubilees, argues that while we shouldn't treat the book as historically infallible, it preserves ancient traditions about early biblical history that may contain kernels of authentic historical memory. The reality is that we have to make decisions about how to evaluate ancient sources, and different people will come to different conclusions based on their religious beliefs, their approach to biblical interpretation, and their assessment of the historical evidence. But here's what's fascinating. Even if we don't accept the specific details provided by Jubilees, the book represents an ancient attempt to solve the same logical problems that modern readers encounter when they read Genesis carefully. The writers of Jubilees recognize that for Cain to have found a wife, for human populations to have grown, and for the biblical narrative to make logical sense, there had to be more children born to Adam and Eve than just the 3 sons mentioned by name in Genesis. This ancient text also provides insight into how marriage and family relationships worked in those early generations. According to Jubilees, marriages between siblings and close relatives were not only acceptable, but necessary for the continuation of the human race. The text presents these relationships matter-of-factly, without any sense of moral concern or divine disapproval. Interestingly, this approach aligns with what we know about marriage practices in other ancient Near Eastern cultures. Archaeological evidence from Mesopotamia Egypt, and other contemporary civilizations shows that marriage between close relatives was common and often preferred among ruling families and important social groups. In ancient Egypt, for example, royal siblings frequently married each other to preserve bloodlines and consolidate power. The pharaohs Akhenaten and Tutankhamun both married their sisters, and this practice continued for centuries. Similarly, we see close family marriages throughout early biblical history, even in the canonical text. Abraham married his half-sister Sarah. Isaac married Rebekah, who was his first cousin once removed. Jacob married two sisters, Leah and Rachel, who were his first cousins. These practices continued to be acceptable in biblical culture until the law of Moses specifically prohibited them in Leviticus 18. Even then, some forms of cousin marriage remained permissible and even encouraged for certain social and religious reasons. But whether we get our information from Jubilees or from logical inference based on the canonical biblical text, the conclusion is the same. Cain's wife was most likely his sister, born to Adam and Eve, but not mentioned by name in the Genesis account. This brings us to a crucial question. If this explanation makes logical sense, if it aligns with ancient cultural practices, and if it solves the mystery of Cain's wife, why do some people still find it difficult to accept? Part of the answer lies in modern sensibilities about family relationships. We live in a world where close family marriage is not only unnecessary, but legally prohibited and socially taboo. It's natural for us to project our modern understanding backward onto ancient situations. But part of the answer also lies in a deeper question about the nature of early humanity itself. Were the first humans really as genetically robust as this explanation requires? Is it scientifically plausible that siblings could have married and produced healthy offspring for multiple generations? The answer to that question takes us into some of the most cutting-edge research in modern genetics and evolutionary biology. When most people think about small populations trying to survive and reproduce, they immediately think about the genetic problems that can arise from inbreeding. And they're right to be concerned. In modern populations, marriage between close relatives can lead to serious genetic disorders, birth defects, and reduced fertility. But here's what most people don't realize. The genetic problems we associate with inbreeding are largely the result of accumulated genetic damage that has built up over thousands of generations. The closer we get to the original genetic template of humanity, the less problematic close family reproduction becomes. Dr. John Sanford, former Cornell University professor and inventor of the gene gun technology used in genetic engineering, has spent years researching what he calls genetic entropy, the gradual degradation of the human genome over time. His research, published in peer-reviewed journals and detailed in his book, Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Genome, shows that the human genetic code is constantly accumulating small mutations, most of which are harmful or neutral. Over many generations, these mutations build up and cause the overall fitness of the human genome to decline. This means that humans living today have significantly more genetic damage than humans who lived even a few thousand years ago. And humans who lived at the very beginning of human history would have had essentially perfect genetic material. Think about it this way. If Adam and Eve were created with optimal genetic code, no mutations, no genetic diseases, no accumulated damage, then their children would have inherited this genetic superiority. Marriage between siblings in the first few generations wouldn't carry the same risks that it does today because there would be no damaged genes to double up on. This isn't just theoretical speculation. Modern genetic research has provided extensive evidence for how genetic systems work in small founding populations. One of the most famous examples comes from Tristan da Cunha, a remote island in the South Atlantic. In 1816, a small group of settlers, just 15 individuals, founded a colony on this isolated island. Despite being cut off from the outside world and intermarrying for generations, the population grew to several hundred people by the 20th century. While the Tristan da Cunha population did eventually develop some genetic health issues, they survived and thrived for many generations despite their extremely limited genetic base. And this was with 19th century humans who already carried thousands of years of accumulated genetic damage. Dr. Spencer Wells, a geneticist and anthropologist who has studied human population genetics extensively, points out that all of modern humanity shows evidence of having passed through what scientists call a genetic bottleneck, a period when the total human population was very small. Genetic analysis suggests that at some point in human history, the total breeding population may have been as small as a few thousand individuals. The Amish communities in America provide another fascinating modern example. The Amish population in North America descends from only about 200 founding individuals who immigrated from Europe in the 1700s and early 1800s. Despite generations of intermarriage within a relatively closed community, the Amish population has grown to over 300,000 people and remains genetically viable. While the Amish do have higher rates of certain genetic disorders compared to the general population, they also have lower rates of many other health problems. Their genetic health issues are manageable and don't prevent the community from thriving and growing. Now imagine how much more viable a small founding population would be if it started with perfect genetic material rather than the already damaged genes that 18th century Europeans carried. But genetics isn't the only scientific consideration. We also need to think about population dynamics and reproductive strategies. Modern demographic studies show that high fertility populations can grow extraordinarily quickly under the right conditions. The Hutterites, a religious community known for having large families, average about 10 to 12 children per family. But even more remarkable growth rates are possible when we're talking about populations with lifespans measured in centuries rather than decades. Dr. Henry Morris calculated that if Adam and Eve lived for 900 plus years and maintained the fertility patterns of high reproduction populations, they could have had over 100 children during their lifespans. Even with much more conservative estimates, say 20, 30 children, the mathematics of population growth become quite impressive. Consider this scenario. Adam and Eve have 20 children over the course of several centuries. Those children reach maturity, which might take longer in a world where people live for centuries, and begin having families of their own. If each family averages even 8-10 children, and if people are living for 500-900 years, the population could easily reach several hundred individuals within a few centuries of creation. This rapid population growth would explain several puzzling aspects of the early Genesis narrative. It explains why Cain was afraid of being killed by whoever finds me. It explains why God placed a protective mark on him. It explains how Cain could find a wife and build a city. But it also aligns with archaeological evidence of early human civilizations appearing relatively suddenly in the historical record. With sophisticated social organization, complex technologies, and evidence of large-scale coordination and planning. The Göbekli Tepe site in Turkey, for example, shows evidence of massive construction projects that would have required significant populations and advanced organizational capabilities. The site has been dated to around 9500 BCE, which many biblical chronologists place within the time frame of early post-Eden human history. Similar patterns appear in archaeological sites around the world. Evidence of human settlements appearing relatively suddenly with sophisticated technologies and social organization, suggesting that human populations were larger and more organized than traditional models might suggest. From a purely scientific standpoint, there's nothing implausible about the idea that humanity began with a founding population of 2 individuals who had superior genetic material and extraordinary lifespans. In fact, given what we know about genetics, population dynamics, and human reproductive potential, such a scenario could easily lead to thriving populations within relatively short timeframes. But science is only part of the picture. To fully understand how early human marriage and family relationships worked, we need to examine the cultural and legal context in which these early families operated. To understand why Cain marrying his sister wouldn't have been scandalous or problematic in the ancient world, we need to step back and examine how marriage actually functioned in early human societies. The rules, taboos, and expectations that govern marriage in modern America are actually quite recent developments in human history. Throughout most of human civilization, marriage has been primarily about survival, alliance building, and the continuation of family lines rather than romantic love or personal fulfillment. And in small, isolated populations, marriage between close relatives wasn't just acceptable, it was often necessary and even preferred. Let's look at what we know about marriage practices in the ancient Near East. The cultural context in which the biblical narratives took place. Archaeological evidence from Mesopotamia, Egypt, and other early civilizations shows that marriage between siblings, half-siblings, and cousins was not only common, but often encouraged among ruling families and important social groups. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest known legal documents, dating to around 1750 BCE, contains regulations about marriage between relatives, but doesn't prohibit it. Instead, it regulates it. In ancient Egypt, royal families routinely practiced sibling marriage. Pharaohs married their sisters to keep the bloodline pure and to consolidate power within the family. This practice continued for over 3,000 years of Egyptian history. The famous pharaohs Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and Cleopatra all married close relatives. But this wasn't limited to royalty. Archaeological evidence from marriage contracts, tomb inscriptions, and other documents shows that marriage between cousins and other relatives was common throughout Egyptian society, particularly among property-owning families who wanted to keep wealth and land within the family line. Similar patterns appear throughout the ancient world. In ancient Persia, the Zoroastrian religion actually encouraged marriage between close relatives, considering it a religious virtue. Greek and Roman societies, while generally preferring marriage outside the immediate family, still commonly practiced cousin marriage and had no legal prohibitions against it. Most importantly for our discussion, marriage between close relatives was clearly acceptable in biblical culture throughout most of the Old Testament period. We see this pattern repeatedly in the biblical narrative itself. Abraham married Sarah, who was his half-sister. Genesis 20:12 records Abraham saying, "She really is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not of my mother, and she became my wife." This marriage was not only acceptable, but was blessed by God and produced Isaac, the child of promise. Isaac married Rebekah, who was his first cousin once removed, the granddaughter of Abraham's brother, Nahor. This marriage was arranged by Abraham's servant and was clearly seen as ideal because it kept the marriage within the extended family. Jacob married not one but two of his first cousins, Leah and Rachel, the daughters of his uncle Laban. These marriages were not only accepted, but are presented in the biblical narrative as part of God's plan for building the nation of Israel. The pattern is clear. Throughout the early biblical period, marriage between close relatives was not only acceptable, but often preferred. It maintained family purity, kept property and wealth within the clan, and strengthened family bonds and loyalties. This practice only changed with the giving of the law through Moses, probably around 1400 to 1300 BCE. Leviticus 18 specifically prohibits marriage between siblings, between parents and children, and between various other close relatives. But even then, cousin marriage remained acceptable and was sometimes encouraged. Dr. Carol Myers, a biblical scholar at Duke University who has extensively studied ancient family structures, points out that these marriage laws weren't given because close family marriage was inherently wrong, but because they served specific social and religious functions in the developing Israelite society. By the time of Moses, the Israelite population had grown large enough that marriage outside the immediate family was readily available. The laws also helped distinguish Israelite practices from those of surrounding cultures, and may have been intended to prevent some of the genetic problems that can arise from close intermarriage over many generations. But in the very early period we're talking about, the time of Adam, Eve, and their immediate descendants, these laws didn't yet exist, and the circumstances were completely different. Think about it from a practical standpoint. If you're part of a community of 5,100 people, all descended from the same original parents, and you need to find a spouse to start a family, your options are extremely limited. Marriage within the extended family isn't just acceptable, it's the only realistic possibility. American history provides some interesting parallels. When small groups of settlers established communities on the frontier, they often had to intermarry within the community for several generations before the population grew large enough to provide other options. The Jamestown colony, founded in 1607, started with only 104 colonists. By 1609, disease and hardship had reduced that number to just 60 survivors. These colonists had to intermarry within the small community to survive and grow. While they didn't practice sibling marriage, they did frequently marry cousins and other relatives within the limited gene pool of the early colony. Similar patterns occurred throughout American frontier history. Small communities of Mormon pioneers, Amish settlers, and other religious or ethnic groups often intermarried for generations before growing large enough to provide more diverse marriage options. The key difference, of course, is that these American settlers were already carrying thousands of years of accumulated genetic damage. The early descendants of Adam and Eve would have started with much more robust genetic material, making close family marriage much safer from a biological standpoint. From a cultural perspective, there would have been no taboo against such marriages because the social structures and religious laws that created those taboos didn't yet exist. From a practical perspective, such marriages would have been necessary for the survival and growth of the human race. But understanding the cultural context of early human marriage leads us to another fascinating aspect of Cain's story. One that reveals something profound about human nature, redemption, and the possibility of transformation even after the most terrible failures. One of the most intriguing aspects of Cain's story is what happened after he was banished from God's presence. The biblical narrative takes an unexpected turn that reveals something profound about human nature, divine mercy, and the possibility of redemption even in the darkest circumstances. Genesis 4:17 tells us, Cain made love to his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Enoch. Cain was then building a city, and he named it after his son Enoch. Wait, stop right there. Cain was building a city? Remember, this is the man who had just been cursed by God to be a restless wanderer on the earth. Yet here we find him not wandering aimlessly, but settling down, starting a family, and engaging in one of the most ambitious and forward-thinking activities imaginable, building the world's first city. This apparent contradiction has puzzled biblical scholars for centuries. How could a man cursed to be a wanderer become a city builder? Was Cain defying God's curse, or was something else happening here? To understand this paradox, we need to think carefully about what cities represent in human civilization. Cities aren't just collections of buildings. They're symbols of permanence, community, cooperation, and hope for the future. Building a city requires long-term planning, cooperation with others, and a belief that tomorrow will be better than today. Dr. Lewis Mumford, one of America's foremost urban historians, argued that the creation of cities represents one of humanity's greatest achievements: the transformation of mere survival into civilization, of individual struggle into collective flourishing. The fact that Cain chose to build a city rather than simply establishing a temporary camp or remaining nomadic suggests something remarkable about his psychological and spiritual state. Despite his guilt, despite his punishment, despite being cast out from God's presence, Cain was still looking toward the future with hope and ambition. Some biblical scholars suggest that Cain's city building wasn't an act of defiance against God's curse, but rather a fulfillment of the original human mandate to subdue and have dominion over the earth. Even in his fallen state, even after committing murder, Cain retained some aspect of the divine image that drove him to create, to build, to organize. The city of Enoch, named after Cain's firstborn son, represents the first recorded attempt at permanent human settlement. Archaeological evidence suggests that the development of cities was indeed one of the most crucial steps in human civilization, leading to advances in technology, agriculture, trade, and social organization. But here's what makes Cain's city building even more fascinating. It required cooperation with other people. You can't build a city by yourself. Even a small settlement requires multiple families working together, sharing resources, dividing labor, and creating social structures for governance and conflict resolution. This means that by the time Cain built his city, the human population had grown large enough to support urban development. There were enough people available to join Cain in his building project, enough families to populate the settlement, enough workers to carry out the complex tasks required for urban construction. Modern urban planning research shows that even small cities require populations of several hundred to several thousand people to be viable. They need farmers to produce food, craftsmen to make tools and buildings, traders to exchange goods, and leaders to coordinate activities and resolve disputes. The existence of Enoch as a functioning city suggests that the human population had grown substantially by this point in the biblical narrative. We're not talking about a handful of people scratching out a survival existence. We're talking about a thriving community, large enough to support specialized roles and complex social organization. This aligns perfectly with our earlier analysis of population growth patterns. If Adam and Eve had been having children for several centuries, and if those children had begun having families of their own, the total human population could easily have reached the hundreds or even thousands by the time Cain built his city. But the story of Enoch reveals something else that's crucial for understanding early human development: the emergence of human culture and creativity. Genesis 4:20-22 tells us about Cain's descendants and their innovations. Jabal was the father of those who live in tents and raise livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all who play the harp and flute. Zaphon Tubal Cain forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron. This passage describes the development of pastoral agriculture, music, and metallurgy, three of the most important technological advances in human history. These innovations didn't happen in isolation. They developed within the urban environment that Cain created. Cities have always been centers of innovation and cultural development. When people live in close proximity, sharing ideas and resources, technological and cultural advancement accelerates dramatically. The same pattern we see in Cain's lineage has been repeated throughout history, from ancient Mesopotamia to Silicon Valley. But there's also a spiritual dimension to Cain's transformation that we can't ignore. While Cain's descendants were developing technology and culture, Genesis 4:26 tells us that it was during this same period that people began to call on the name of the Lord. This suggests that while Cain's line was pursuing technological and cultural advancement, other branches of the human family were focusing on spiritual development and relationship with God. Both streams were important for human flourishing. American history provides fascinating parallels to this pattern. The founders of many American cities were people who had experienced failure, disgrace, or exile from their previous communities. Yet they channeled their drive for redemption into building something new and significant. Consider the story of James Oglethorpe, who founded the colony of Georgia as a place where debtors and other social outcasts could start fresh and build productive lives. Or think about the countless American frontier towns founded by people fleeing scandal, failure, or disappointment in their previous communities. The American West is full of stories about people who made terrible mistakes, sometimes even criminal ones, but who channeled their energy into building communities, businesses, and institutions that benefited others and left positive legacies. Cain's story suggests that even the worst human failures don't necessarily disqualify us from making positive contributions to the world. His transformation from murderer to city builder demonstrates the remarkable human capacity for reinvention and the possibility of creating something constructive, even in the aftermath of terrible destruction. But Cain's story is just one thread in a larger tapestry of early human development. To fully understand the significance of his transformation, we need to examine how his legacy compared to that of his brother Seth, and how these two family lines shaped the spiritual and cultural development of humanity. The story of early humanity isn't just about individuals. It's about the choices that shaped entire lineages and ultimately influenced the spiritual and cultural trajectory of our species. In the aftermath of Abel's murder and Cain's exile, two distinct family lines emerged that would represent two very different approaches to human existence. These weren't just different families. They were different philosophies of life, different relationships with God, and different visions for what human civilization could become. Let's start with Cain's lineage. As we've seen, Cain became a city builder, and his descendants became innovators and creators. Genesis 4 tells us that Cain's line produced some of humanity's most important technological advances. Jabal was the father of those who live in tents and raise livestock. Essentially, he invented pastoral agriculture, the practice of raising domestic animals for food, clothing, and transportation. This innovation allowed human populations to grow much larger and to settle in areas that wouldn't support farming. Jubal was the father of all who play the harp and flute. He pioneered music and musical instruments. Music isn't just entertainment. It's one of the most fundamental aspects of human culture, used for worship, storytelling, education, and community bonding. Tubal-Cain forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron. He developed metallurgy, the technology that would eventually lead to advanced weapons, agricultural tools, construction equipment, and countless other innovations that shaped human civilization. These weren't minor achievements. These were foundational technologies that transformed human existence and made possible the complex societies we know today. But here's what's interesting about Cain's lineage. While they were advancing technologically and culturally, they were moving further away from God spiritually. The text suggests that Cain's descendants focused on material progress and human achievement rather than spiritual development and divine relationship. This pattern, technological advancement coupled with spiritual decline, has repeated itself throughout human history. Think about the Industrial Revolution in America, which brought incredible technological progress, but also led to social upheaval, environmental destruction, and in many cases, a decline in traditional religious observance. Or consider Silicon Valley today, where technological innovation happens at breakneck speed, but where surveys consistently show lower levels of religious belief and traditional spiritual practice compared to other parts of America. Cain's line represents one possible path for human development, the pursuit of knowledge, technology, and cultural achievement as ends in themselves, without reference to divine purpose or spiritual meaning. Now contrast this with Seth's lineage. Genesis 4:25-26 tells us that after Abel's death, Adam made love to his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth, saying, "God has granted me another child in place of Abel, since Cain killed him." Seth also had a son, and he named him Enosh. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. This is one of the most significant verses in early biblical history. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. This represents the beginning of organized worship, formal prayer, and intentional spiritual community. Seth's lineage became the spiritual leaders of early humanity. While Cain's descendants were developing technology, Seth's descendants were developing theology. While Cain's line was building cities, Seth's line was building relationships with God. The genealogy in Genesis 5 shows us the remarkable spiritual achievements of Seth's lineage. Enoch, who walked faithfully with God, then he was no more, because God took him away, represents the pinnacle of human spiritual achievement. A man so close to God that he bypassed death entirely. Methuselah, who lived 969 years, represents the culmination of human longevity and wisdom. His very name is associated with endurance and the accumulation of knowledge over vast periods of time. And finally, Noah, a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God, became the instrument through which God preserved humanity during the Great Flood. Seth's lineage represents the other possible path for human development, the pursuit of spiritual growth, divine relationship, and moral excellence as the highest goals of human existence. But here's what's crucial to understand. Both lineages were necessary for human flourishing. Without Cain's line, humanity would have remained technologically primitive. We wouldn't have developed the tools, instruments, and innovations that make complex civilization possible. Art, music, agriculture, and metallurgy, all the foundations of human culture, came through Cain's descendants. Without Seth's line, humanity would have lost its spiritual moorings. We would have become technologically advanced but spiritually bankrupt, capable of great achievements, but without moral guidance or divine purpose. Dr. Francis Schaeffer, the influential American theologian and philosopher, argued that this tension between technological advancement and spiritual development has been one of the defining characteristics of human civilization throughout history. American history provides a perfect example of this dynamic. The founders of America were deeply influenced by both streams. They embraced technological innovation and economic development, but they also maintained strong commitments to spiritual principles and divine guidance. The tension between these two approaches, the material and the spiritual, the technological and the theological, continues to shape American society today. Silicon Valley and Hollywood represent one stream. The Bible Belt and religious communities represent the other. But the most successful and balanced societies have always found ways to integrate both approaches. They pursue technological advancement while maintaining spiritual grounding. They embrace innovation while preserving moral foundations. This is exactly what we see happening in the biblical narrative. Eventually, these two lineages came back together. Noah, from Seth's spiritual line, preserved humanity through the flood. But Noah's descendants included people who carried forward both the technological innovations of Cain's line and the spiritual heritage of Seth's line. Abraham, who came from Noah's lineage, was both spiritually devoted to God and technologically sophisticated enough to manage large households, complex trade relationships, and advanced agricultural operations. David was both a warrior king who used advanced military technology and a psalmist who wrote some of the most beautiful spiritual poetry in human history. Solomon built the most technologically advanced temple of the ancient world, while also becoming known for his spiritual wisdom and divine insight. The pattern continues right through to Jesus himself, who was described as both a skilled craftsman, a tekton, or builder, engineer, and the spiritual savior of humanity. The story of Cain and Seth's lineages teaches us that the goal isn't to choose between technological advancement and spiritual development. It's to integrate both into a balanced and flourishing human existence. But what does this ancient story mean for us today? How do these patterns from the dawn of human history apply to our modern lives and contemporary challenges? The ancient story of Cain's wife and the forgotten daughters of Eden isn't just a historical curiosity or a theological puzzle. It's a mirror that reflects some of the most important challenges and opportunities facing us in the modern world. When we strip away the ancient language and cultural context, we find that the fundamental human dynamics described in these early chapters of Genesis are still playing out in American families, communities, and society today. Let's start with the most obvious parallel: sibling rivalry and family conflict. The story of Cain and Abel represents the archetypal struggle between siblings that psychologists have documented in families across every culture and time period. Dr. Terry Apter, a psychologist at Cambridge University who has studied family dynamics for decades, notes that sibling rivalry often stems from the same sources we see in Cain's story: perceived parental favoritism, competition for recognition, and different personality types within the same family. Modern research shows that birth order, personality differences, and family dynamics can create the same kinds of tensions that led to tragedy in the world's first family. The difference is that we now have better tools for understanding and managing these conflicts before they escalate to destructive levels. American families today can learn from Cain's story by recognizing early warning signs of sibling rivalry and jealousy, addressing perceptions of unfairness or favoritism, and teaching children healthy ways to handle disappointment and competition. But the story goes deeper than just family dynamics. It also addresses fundamental questions about justice, punishment, and redemption that are central to American legal and social philosophy. Consider how God responded to Cain's crime. Yes, there was punishment, exile and the loss of agricultural productivity. But there was also protection, the mark that prevented others from taking vengeance on him. Even after committing murder, Cain was given the opportunity to build a new life and make positive contributions to human civilization. This balance between justice and mercy, between punishment and restoration, reflects principles that are foundational to American ideals about criminal justice and social rehabilitation. The American justice system, at its best, seeks not just to punish wrongdoing, but to create opportunities for offenders to transform their lives and make positive contributions to society. Programs that focus on restorative justice, education, and job training for former inmates reflect the same recognition that even people who have done terrible things can potentially be redeemed and become productive members of society. Cain's transformation from murderer to city builder demonstrates that people's worst moments don't have to define their entire lives. This is a fundamentally American idea: the belief in second chances, in the possibility of reinvention, and in the power of individuals to overcome their past failures and create something positive. Think about some of America's most inspiring success stories. Malcolm X transformed from a criminal to a civil rights leader. Johnny Cash went from drug addiction and legal troubles to becoming one of America's most beloved musicians and spiritual figures. Robert Downey Jr. overcame addiction and legal problems to become one of Hollywood's most successful actors. These modern examples echo the same pattern we see in Cain's story: failure, consequences, transformation, and ultimately, positive contribution to society. But the story also addresses contemporary debates about science and faith, about how we understand human origins and development. The scientific evidence we've discussed about population genetics, genetic diversity, and early human development doesn't contradict the biblical narrative. Instead, it provides a framework for understanding how the events described in Genesis could have actually occurred. This is crucial for American Christians, who often feel forced to choose between scientific evidence and religious belief. The story of early human development shows that faith and reason can work together, that scientific investigation can actually deepen our understanding of spiritual truths rather than undermining them. Dr. Francis Collins, the geneticist who led the Human Genome Project and served as director of the National Institutes of Health, has argued that scientific discovery often reveals the elegance and sophistication of divine design, rather than disproving it. The genetic evidence for human population bottlenecks, the mathematical models of early population growth, and the archaeological evidence of rapid human cultural development all align with the biblical account of humanity, beginning with a small founding population that quickly developed complex societies. This integration of scientific and spiritual understanding represents a mature approach to faith that doesn't require us to ignore evidence or shut down intellectual curiosity. The story of the forgotten daughters also speaks to contemporary discussions about gender equality and the recognition of women's contributions to society. The fact that these women played essential roles in human survival and development, but were largely omitted from the historical record, reflects patterns that continued throughout much of human history. Women's contributions were often crucial but undervalued, essential but uncelebrated. This reminds us of the importance of recognizing and valuing all contributions to society, regardless of gender. It also highlights how historical narratives have often been incomplete, focusing on certain types of achievements while overlooking others that were equally important. Finally, the story addresses one of the most fundamental questions facing American society today. How do we balance individual achievement with community responsibility? Cain's line represents the path of individual achievement, technological innovation, and cultural advancement. Seth's line represents the path of spiritual development, community building, and moral growth. American society has always struggled with this balance. We celebrate individual success and innovation, but we also recognize the importance of community, shared values, and social responsibility. The biblical narrative suggests that both approaches are necessary for human flourishing, but they need to be integrated rather than pursued in isolation. Pure individualism leads to spiritual emptiness and social fragmentation. Pure communitarianism stifles innovation and individual growth. The most successful American communities and institutions have found ways to encourage individual excellence while maintaining strong social bonds and shared moral foundations. Silicon Valley companies that provide both cutting-edge innovation and strong community support for their employees. Religious communities that embrace both spiritual growth and technological advancement. Educational institutions that promote both academic achievement and character development. The ancient story of humanity's first family turns out to be remarkably relevant to the choices we face as individuals, families, and communities today. But perhaps the most important lesson from this ancient mystery is about the power of seeking truth, asking questions, and refusing to accept easy answers when deeper understanding is possible. As we reach the end of our journey through one of the Bible's most enduring mysteries, it's worth reflecting on what we've discovered and what it means for how we approach both ancient texts and modern questions. The mystery of Cain's wife, which has puzzled readers for thousands of years, turns out to have several plausible explanations. Most likely, Cain married one of his sisters, a daughter of Adam and Eve, whose name wasn't recorded in the biblical text, but whose existence was essential for the continuation of the human race. This explanation aligns with the cultural practices of the ancient world. Makes sense given the genetic realities of early human populations, and fits perfectly with the biblical timeline and narrative structure. But perhaps more importantly, our investigation has revealed that this seemingly simple question opens up profound insights into human nature. Divine mercy, family dynamics, technological development, spiritual growth, and the integration of faith and reason. We've seen how modern scientific research actually supports and illuminates the biblical account rather than contradicting it. Population genetics, demographic modeling, and archaeological evidence all provide frameworks for understanding how the events described in Genesis could have occurred in real history. We've discovered how ancient texts like the Book of Jubilees, while not canonically accepted, preserve traditions and insights that help fill in the gaps left by the biblical narrative. We've explored how marriage and family relationships worked in the ancient world, and why practices that seem strange to us today were not only acceptable, but necessary for human survival and flourishing. We've traced the development of human civilization through the lineages of Cain and Seth, seeing how technological advancement and spiritual development represent two essential, but sometimes competing aspects of human nature. And we've seen how these ancient patterns continue to play out in contemporary American society, offering insights into modern challenges around family dynamics, criminal justice, scientific faith integration, gender equality, and the balance between individual achievement and community responsibility. But perhaps the most important discovery is methodological. The value of approaching ancient texts with both reverence and intellectual curiosity, of asking hard questions while maintaining faith, and of refusing to accept superficial answers when deeper understanding is possible. Too often, discussions of biblical mysteries degenerate into defensive posturing or skeptical dismissal. Some people feel that questioning the text shows a lack of faith. Others assume that ancient texts can't possibly contain reliable information about early human history. Our investigation suggests a different approach: rigorous inquiry in service of deeper understanding. When we bring together biblical scholarship, archaeological evidence, genetic research, cultural analysis, and historical investigation, we don't undermine faith. We enrich it. The Bible was never intended to answer every question we might have about early human history. It's a selective narrative that focuses on the most important themes and characters rather than providing comprehensive historical documentation. But the questions that arise from careful reading of the text aren't problems to be defended against. They're invitations to deeper investigation. And when we accept those invitations, we often discover that apparent contradictions resolve into complex harmonies, that puzzling details reveal unexpected depths, and that ancient wisdom speaks to contemporary concerns in remarkably relevant ways. The story of Cain's wife reminds us that even the most familiar biblical narratives contain layers of meaning that reward careful study. It challenges us to think deeply about human origins, family relationships, moral development, and the integration of faith and reason. Most importantly, it demonstrates that seeking truth doesn't require us to abandon faith, and that maintaining faith doesn't require us to avoid difficult questions. Whether you're a believer seeking to understand your faith more deeply, a skeptic curious about how ancient texts relate to modern knowledge, or simply someone fascinated by the enduring mysteries of human history, the story of Cain's wife offers something valuable. It reminds us that we're all part of an ancient story that began in a garden, but continues in our families, our communities, and our choices today. The questions that puzzled our ancestors continue to challenge us, and the wisdom they discovered through investigation and reflection can still guide us as we navigate our own complex world. The forgotten daughters of Eden may not have had their names recorded in Scripture, but their legacy lives on in every family that chooses love over jealousy, cooperation over competition, and hope over despair. And perhaps that's the most profound truth of all, that the most important stories aren't always the ones that get the most attention, and that the deepest mysteries often reveal themselves not to those who claim to have all the answers, but to those who are brave enough to keep asking questions. So what do you think? Have we solved the mystery of Cain's wife? Or have we simply uncovered deeper questions that invite even more investigation? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this exploration has sparked your curiosity about other biblical mysteries, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because there are many more ancient puzzles waiting to be explored. The journey of discovery is just beginning.